The first thing you should understand is that becoming an interstellar exchange student isn't as glamorous as it sounds, especially when you're human. Especially when you're me, Jackson Miller, from a little town in Colorado that most aliens couldn't find on a star chart if their lives depended on it. Zentari University of Interstellar Studies wasn't just a school. It was a cosmic melting pot suspended in what scientists politely called a quantum-stabilized gravitational anomaly, which is a fancy way of saying the entire campus existed in a place where physics was more of a suggestion than a law. Imagine a university campus designed by a committee of mathematicians, artists, and beings who considered three-dimensional space a cute but limited concept. The campus itself was a living, breathing entity, literally. The primary structure was a massive bioorganic construct that shifted and breathed, its crystalline segments changing color and configuration based on ambient emotional energy, academic activity, and what I suspected was some kind of complicated alien mood ring logic. Lecture halls would expand, contract, split, and merge with a fluidity that would make Earth architects weep. My arrival had been complicated. The Galactic Exchange Screening Committee had spent 6 months debating whether humans were even worth including in the program. Their initial reports were diplomatic but painfully condescending, technologically nascent, highly emotional, prone to conflict, potential liability. As if other species weren't exactly the same, just with more tentacles or better camouflage. Professor Krell Knox, my primary academic advisor, was a luminary in a species that communicated through complex light patterns and existed in a state somewhere between energy and matter. Imagine an intelligent, academic chandelier with attitude. His introduction to me had been equal parts fascination and barely concealed patronage. Humans are. An interesting experiment, he'd said during my initial orientation, his bioluminescent tendrils shifting through colors that I was pretty sure translated to something between mildly amused and slightly concerned. You represent one of the youngest spacefaring species we've encountered. Your technological progress is surprisingly rapid, given your biological limitations. Biological limitations. Right. The orientation hall was a marvel of interstellar design. Students from 17 confirmed star systems mingled, their physiological differences making a United Nations meeting look like a homogeneous group gathering. To my left, a chlorophyllian student was simultaneously studying, photosynthesizing, and having what appeared to be a complex mathematical argument with itself through subtle shifts in its translucent green skin. To my right, a silicon-based lifeform was processing lecture notes by literally rearranging its internal crystal matrix, each movement a complex computational gesture. And then there was me. Jackson Miller, 5'11", 180 pounds, disappointingly bipedal, distressingly pink, about as exciting as unseasoned chicken breast in a universe of culinary possibility. My university-issued universal translator, a marvel of technology that looked like a sleek earpiece but could interpret everything from subsonic rumbles to bioluminescent communication, occasionally glitched when confronted with human idioms. It had a particular problem with sarcasm, which, given my personality, was going to be a problem. The campus itself seemed to breathe with academic energy. Floating lecture pods drifted between massive crystalline structures. Gravity was more of a polite recommendation than a hard rule. Students moved in three-dimensional space with a grace that made my earthbound movement look like a drunk elephant attempting ballet. My first class, Xenobiological Adaptation Theory, was a perfect microcosm of the university's diversity. Professor Lim Era, a tentacled being who seemed to be simultaneously a lecturer, a living database, and possibly a small transportation system, was discussing the fundamental principles of biological adaptation across different planetary environments. Adaptation is not merely physical, she was saying, her multiple vocal organs producing a sound that was part speech, part song, part ultrasonic ping, but a complex interplay of physiological, psychological, and cultural mechanisms. Little did they know that humans were about to become the case study that would turn everything they thought they knew about adaptation on its head. Because humans? We don't just adapt, we weaponize adaptation. And I was about to prove it. Let me tell you something about galactic perception. When most advanced civilizations look at humanity, they see a species that's barely managed to stop throwing rocks at each other long enough to develop rudimentary space travel. They see primitive carbon-based lifeforms who still argue about imaginary lines on a planet, who burn dead dinosaur remains to move around, and who consider social media a legitimate form of communication. What they don't see is the raw, unfiltered potential of a species that domesticated wolves, invented extreme sports for fun, and considers climbing Mount Everest a reasonable weekend activity. My placement in the Galactic Exchange Program was less a diplomatic mission and more a cosmic practical joke. The selection process had been grueling not just for me, but for the selection committee. They'd spent months analyzing human psychological profiles, trying to determine if we were more likely to start an intergalactic incident or provide some marginally interesting data point. I knew my file was thick. Growing up in a small Colorado mountain town meant I'd been exposed to survival scenarios that would make most alien species curl up and surrender. My childhood wasn't just a preparation for life, it was a masterclass in adaptation. Take my father, for instance. Marcus Miller was the kind of person who viewed inconvenience as a challenge to be conquered. When our water pump broke during a particularly brutal winter, he didn't call a repair service. No, he spent 3 days in sub-zero temperatures, rebuilding the entire system with nothing more than a wrench, determination, and what I'm pretty sure was pure human spite. My mother, Elena, a search and rescue coordinator with a PhD in geological engineering, was no less impressive. I'd grown up hearing stories of her rescuing lost hikers from impossible terrain, navigating through snowstorms that would freeze most equipment, and doing it with a level of calm that bordered on the supernatural. The Galactic Evaluation Committee had a thick file on me. They knew about my wilderness survival training, my competitive rock climbing, my brief stint in emergency medical services. What they didn't understand was that these weren't just skills, they were a fundamental expression of human adaptability. Professor Krell Knox's initial report on my candidacy was a masterpiece of diplomatic understatement. Subject: Jackson Miller. Species: human Terra. Sol system. Preliminary psychological assessment: unpredictable. Potentially volatile. Shows concerning tendencies toward unnecessary risk-taking. Demonstrates remarkable problem-solving skills coupled with what can only be described as a statistically improbable survival instinct. Unpredictable. That's basically the human motto. The university's xenobiological records were filled with misconceptions about humanity. Most alien species viewed us as soft, emotional creatures trapped on a single planetary ecosystem. They saw our relatively short lifespans, our lack of natural defensive mechanisms, and assumed we were somehow less capable. What they didn't understand was that humans don't need natural defenses when we can invent them. Take the Voltari, for example, a species of silicon-based life forms who considered themselves the pinnacle of evolutionary engineering. They had exoskeletons that could withstand extreme radiation, could photosynthesize energy directly, and could communicate through complex quantum entanglement. They looked at humans and saw weakness. Soft skin, no natural armor, no ability to regenerate, no integrated communication networks. What they didn't see was that humans invented things like Kevlar, nuclear energy, and the internet. We don't evolve additional limbs, we build machines that give us capabilities beyond our biological limitations. During my initial orientation, I'd watched the various alien species sizing me up. The chlorophyllians, with their translucent skin that could directly convert solar energy. The silicon-based Voltari, with their crystalline internal structures. The energy-based luminarians like Professor Krell Knox, who existed in states that defied traditional biological classification. And then there was me. Just me. A slightly above-average height human with an apparently unremarkable physical structure. Little did they know that I was about to become their worst nightmare, a walking, talking demonstration of why humanity was not to be underestimated. Because humans? We don't just survive. We thrive. We turn limitations into opportunities. We look at the impossible and treat it like a mild inconvenience. And I was going to prove it. Professor Limara's tentacles were doing that thing where they simultaneously translated her speech, projected holographic diagrams, and probably solved advanced quantum equations, all while maintaining perfect eye contact with every student in the multidimensional lecture hall. A biological adaptation. She was saying, her voice a melodic blend of subsonic vibrations and crystalline resonances, represents the fundamental method by which species survive in challenging environments. Most advanced civilizations develop technological solutions to overcome environmental limitations. A Voltari student, Crixval, if I remembered correctly, raised a crystalline appendage. Precisely, he said, his internal structures shifting to produce a sound that translated as pure academic smugness. Technological intervention eliminates the need for primitive biological adaptation. Why evolve when you can engineer? I should have kept quiet. Really. But something in me, maybe generations of human smartasses coded into my DNA, couldn't let that slide. Tell me about sharks, I said. The entire lecture hall went silent. Even the ambient environmental systems seemed to pause. Professor Limara's multiple eye clusters blinked in sequence. "I'm sorry, what?" "Sharks," I repeated. "Let me explain something about sharks, and by extension, about my planet's approach to survival." Crixval's crystalline structure did something that I was pretty sure was the alien equivalent of an eye roll. A primitive marine predator? Hardly relevant to advanced biological discourse. "Oh, you sweet summer alien child. Sharks," I began, "are basically nature's way of saying perfection takes time, but when it arrives, it's terrifying." I stood up, and for the first time, I felt the entire room's attention focus entirely on me. The chlorophyllian student's translucent skin rippled with curiosity. The Voltari's internal crystals began to pulse with what I recognized as heightened sensory input. Modern sharks have existed for approximately 450 million years. That's 200 million years before dinosaurs. They survived multiple planetary extinction events. They've seen continents form and break apart. And they did this with a design so perfect that it has required minimal evolutionary adjustment. Professor Limara's tentacles were now fully extended, holographic data streams dancing around her, tracking every word. "Let me break down what makes a shark, I continued. They are literal living fossils. Their skeleton is made of cartilage, which is lighter and more flexible than bone. This means they can bend without breaking. Their skin is covered in dermal denticles, basically microscopic scales that reduce friction and increase swimming efficiency. Imagine armor that also makes you faster." Crixval's crystal structure was now vibrating, a sign of either extreme irritation or intense concentration. Probably both. Sharks don't just have one heart. They have a two-chambered heart that's incredibly efficient. Their liver isn't just an organ, it's a buoyancy control system. They can detect electromagnetic fields. They can smell a single drop of blood in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. And here's the kicker: some shark species never stop moving. They literally have to swim continuously or they'll die. I paused, letting that sink in. But wait, there's more. Great white sharks? They can detect a seal's heartbeat from hundreds of meters away. They can accelerate from 0 to 12 miles per hour in a fraction of a second. Their bite force? Up to 4,000 pounds per square inch. For context, that's stronger than a T-Rex. The chlorophyllian students were now fully translucent, a sign of complete absorption. Even Professor Limara's tentacles had stopped moving, suspended in midair. Sharks aren't just predators. They're living proof that sometimes the most effective design is the one that's been refined over hundreds of millions of years. They don't need complex technology. They don't need quantum communication. They just work. Crixval finally spoke, his crystal structures producing a sound that translated to pure bewilderment. This is your argument? A marine predator." I grinned. "This is my argument about adaptation, about survival, about what happens when a species gets really, really good at existing." The lecture hall was so quiet you could hear the quantum fluctuations in the environmental systems. And I was just getting started. The silence that followed my shark monologue wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of silence that makes quantum physicists nervous, a profound, multidimensional absence of sound that seemed to stretch across several realities simultaneously. Professor Limara's tentacles were doing something I'd never seen before. They were literally trembling. Not with fear, exactly, but with what I can only describe as academic excitement mixed with a healthy dose of existential recalibration. "Mr. Miller," she said, her multiple vocal organs producing a sound that was part question, part challenge, "are you suggesting that your planet's evolutionary strategy is continuous, aggressive adaptation?" I grinned. "Oh, we're just getting started." Crixval, the Voltari crystal being who had previously dismissed humans as technologically primitive, was now fully transparent, a state I'd learned indicated complete cognitive recalibration among his species. "Sharks were just the appetizer," I continued. "Let me tell you about something called the honey badger syndrome, which, by the way, is a perfect microcosm of how humans approach survival." I could see the universal translators working overtime. Computational matrices were likely melting trying to process the concept. Honey badgers are these small mammalian predators from my planet that basically laugh in the face of physics and common sense. They've been documented attacking animals 5 times their size: lions, venomous snakes, entire bee colonies. They don't just survive, they do it with such aggressive indifference that it becomes a form of performance art. A chlorophyllian student in the back whose name translated to something like photosynthetic wisdom cluster 7 raised a translucent appendage. But surely technological intervention would be more efficient. I laughed. A genuine, full-bodied human laugh that seemed to momentarily confuse the entire lecture hall's quantum harmonics. Efficiency? Let me tell you about human efficiency. We invented something called duct tape adhesive technology so versatile that NASA uses it in space missions. Literally patching spacecraft with the same material people use to fix broken lawn chairs. We look at a problem, and our first question isn't how do we solve this perfectly, it's how do we solve this right now with whatever we have. Professor Limara's holographic displays were now showing comparative charts human technological progression versus other known galactic civilizations. The trajectory was unconventional. Where other species had smooth, calculated growth, humanity's technological development looked like a toddler had been given a crayon and told to draw a straight line. Our entire species operates on what you might call controlled chaos, I explained. We don't just adapt, we weaponize adaptation. Consider mountain climbing. Most species would look at a vertical ice wall and say impossible. Humans look at it and say challenge accepted, and then invent entire technologies just to prove we can reach the top. Crixval's crystal structure was now producing a sound that translated roughly to profound confusion mixed with reluctant respect. Let me give you another example, I continued, warming to my theme. The human immune system. Most species develop specific immunological responses. We develop generalist responses that can be rapidly reconfigured. Our white blood cells are basically microscopic special forces. They don't just defend. They learn, they adapt. They create entire molecular memory banks of potential threats. I was pacing now, my explanation turning into a performance. The lecture hall's quantum responsive architecture was shifting, seemingly resonating with the emotional intensity of the moment. We domesticated wolves and turned them into everything from search and rescue partners to emotional support companions. We live in environments ranging from Arctic tundras to equatorial deserts. We don't just survive in extreme conditions, we thrive, we optimize. We turn limitations into opportunities. The Luminarian students, beings of pure energy who existed in states that defied traditional biological classification, were now fully synchronized, their bioluminescent patterns creating a complex tapestry of intellectual excitement. Technological intervention, I said, looking directly at Crixval. Sure. But we see technology as an extension of our adaptive capacity, not a replacement for it. We don't just engineer solutions, we engineer entire paradigms of problem solving. Professor Limara's tentacles were now fully extended, holographic data streams dancing around her like a digital aurora. Remarkable, she whispered. A statement. Not a question. And I was just getting warmed up. The aftermath of my impromptu human survival manifesto was nothing short of spectacular. Imagine dropping a quantum bomb into an already complex academic ecosystem, and you might come close to understanding the chaos that erupted. Within hours, my lecture hall presentation had become the academic equivalent of a viral internet meme across the entire Zentari University. Holographic communication networks buzzed with recordings, analysis, and increasingly bizarre interpretations of human capabilities. Professor Krell Knox summoned me to his office, a massive, constantly shifting crystal in space that seemed to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensional planes. The moment I entered, I could feel the weight of centuries of galactic academic scrutiny focused entirely on me. Mr. Miller, he began, his bioluminescent tendrils shifting through colors that I was pretty sure translated to deeply perplexed and somewhat terrified. Your presentation has complicated our understanding of biological adaptation. I sat down in a chair that was more of a quantum suggestion than a solid object. Complicated how, exactly? The Luminarians' light patterns accelerated. The Xenobiological Research Consortium has been running emergency symposiums. Your discussion of sharks alone has triggered no less than 17 separate research initiatives. The Voltari delegation has requested comprehensive data on human evolutionary strategies. The chlorophyllian academic network is literally pulsing with excitement. I couldn't help but grin. Just doing my part for interstellar cultural exchange. What they didn't realize was that my lecture was just the tip of the proverbial iceberg. Humans had been quietly terrifying long before we started looking at the stars. The university's quantum communication networks were now filled with increasingly bizarre research proposals. The Voltari wanted comprehensive studies on human pain tolerance. The chlorophyllians were fascinated by our ability to survive in non-optimal environments. The energy-based luminarians were conducting quantum analysis of human psychological adaptation mechanisms. Dr. Zentari, a renowned xenobiological researcher whose species communicated through complex mathematical equations, had already submitted a 700-page preliminary report titled Humans: A Biological Anomaly in Continuous Adaptive Performance. One section, roughly translated, read: Humans do not merely adapt. They weaponize adaptation as a fundamental survival strategy. Their technological development is less a linear progression and more a continuous improvisation of problem-solving methodologies. The campus cafeteria, a multi-dimensional culinary experience that typically catered to approximately 283 different biological requirements, had started a new section specifically designed to understand human dietary habits. They were both terrified and fascinated. Do humans truly consume a substance called ghost pepper? One of the culinary AI systems asked me, its holographic interface flickering with what I can only describe as a mix of horror and respect. A food item scientifically classified as a form of controlled chemical warfare. I just smiled. We call that Tuesday. The research teams were particularly obsessed with human medical capabilities. Our immune systems, our ability to recover from injuries, our psychological resilience, everything was now under intense scrutiny. Professor Limera's research team had started what they called the Miller Protocols, a comprehensive study of human adaptive capabilities. They were particularly fascinated by our ability to transform psychological stress into productive problem-solving. Your species, she told me during a follow-up interview. Her tentacles, creating intricate holographic data streams, doesn't just survive challenges. You seem to generate additional capability from the challenges themselves. The Galactic Exchange Program's administrators were having emergency meetings. My little lecture had turned from a simple student presentation into a potential paradigm shift in how the galaxy viewed humanity. And me? I was just getting started. The universe thought it knew humans, but humans were about to show the galaxy that we were just warming up. 3 standard galactic months after my lecture, the universe had fundamentally changed its perspective on humanity, and I mean that quite literally. The Zentari University's Xenobiological Research Wing had transformed into what was essentially a human obsession laboratory. Entire research teams were now dedicated to understanding what they had started calling Miller dynamics, a term that simultaneously meant human adaptability, unpredictability, and what one luminarian researcher described as controlled biological chaos. Professor Krell Knox invited me to deliver a comprehensive lecture series, not as a student but as a genuine subject matter expert on human survival strategies. The irony was not lost on me. A kid from a small Colorado town was now explaining the intricacies of human existence to the most advanced academic minds in the galaxy. Humanity, I explained during my first comprehensive lecture, is not a species. We're a continuous improvisation. The lecture hall, a quantum-responsive space that could literally reshape itself based on emotional and intellectual energy, was packed. Researchers from 42 different star systems had quantum teleported in just to hear me speak. The environmental systems were working overtime to manage the complex emotional and intellectual resonances. My presentation broke every known academic communication protocol. Instead of structured, linear information delivery, I told stories. Stories about my father rebuilding water pumps in sub-zero temperatures. Stories about search and rescue missions in impossible mountain terrain. Stories about human resilience that defied conventional biological understanding. We don't just adapt, I told them. We transform challenges into opportunities. Our technology isn't just a tool, it's an extension of our evolutionary strategy. The Voltari crystal beings were now fully transparent, a state that indicated complete cognitive recalibration. The chlorophyllians were so absorbed that their typically translucent bodies had become nearly invisible. Even the energy-based luminarians were forming complex quantum patterns that translated to pure academic excitement. But here's the philosophical twist that truly broke their understanding. Humanity's greatest strength wasn't our technology. It wasn't our adaptability. It was our fundamental inability to accept limitation as a permanent condition. Most species, I explained, see a problem and develop a specific solution. Humans see a problem and redesign the entire conceptual framework of problem-solving. Dr. Zentari, the renowned xenobiological researcher, had by now published what was essentially the galactic equivalent of a bestseller. Her comprehensive analysis of human capabilities was titled Homo sapiens: A Biological Anomaly of Continuous Adaptive Performance. One particularly fascinating section read: Humans do not merely interact with their environment. They engage in a continuous dynamic negotiation with the very concept of possibility. The Galactic Exchange Program was fundamentally restructured. Where once humans were seen as a curiosity, we were now viewed as a critical component of interstellar understanding. Our ability to transform, to improvise, to turn limitations into opportunities was now recognized as a unique and valuable evolutionary strategy. My little lecture about sharks had become a turning point in galactic anthropological understanding. As I stood in the lecture hall, watching these incredibly advanced beings process the fundamental nature of human existence, I couldn't help but laugh. We weren't just another species. We were a continuous, beautiful, terrifying experiment in survival. "Welcome," I said to the assembled researchers, to humanity. "We're just getting started." The quantum responsive lecture hall erupted not in applause, but in a complex harmonic resonance that translated to pure, unadulterated respect. And somewhere, I'm pretty sure my parents were laughing.